Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Gran Torino from 2008. Gran Torino. How do I talk about this film? I guess I have to start by talking about Clint Eastwood. I've dreaded watching this film for a long time. And I need to attribute that basically in full to Clint Eastwood. My perception of Clint Eastwood is admittedly very limited, but I feel like I need to outline it. My understanding and knowledge of Clint Eastwood basically is framed around four sort of key points or events or perceptions. The first was prior to this film, his presence in the Fistful of Dollars series. Obviously, Eastwood is very well known for the Fistful of Dollars series, in particular. Why can I not remember of the name of the primary film now? The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is actually not. It's not the. Well, it's the third film, but he was mostly known for that for a long time. He had other roles, but that was like possibly his most well-known film. So I knew him as a film star in that context, even before ever having seen it. It's such a culturally mimetic film that not knowing his face, the grizzled, relatively unshaven, cigarette out of the corner of the mouth face, despite not being an American film, it's an Italian film shot in Spain. It's culturally iconic. So that was my first understanding of Clint Eastwood. The second was the advertisements for this film, Gran Torino. I remember on the TV ads that ran, or possibly even not the TV ads, but it may have been TV ads or trailers in theaters for this film. I haven't gone back and rewatched the trailers, but my recollection is limited to basically one single reverse shot that ran in all of the trailers that I can remember, which is Clint Eastwood standing on a lawn with a rifle in his hand, grimacing the grimaciest grimace you've ever seen in your life, and then a reverse shot of a couple of young Asian people that he's clearly pointing that gun at. We're not going to comment on that right now. We'll get back to it because I need to contextualize it with the other 2 points. Point 3, 2012. Clint Eastwood is a featured speaker at the Republican National Convention. And while I'm going to limit my political commentary here, both out of personal interest and just, political biases and not wanting to delve into all of that, Clint Eastwood standing on a stage talking to an empty chair in lieu of the current, and I have to be very explicit here, black president, is an image that is deeply drilled into my brain as real horrific. I remember that pretty clearly as, oh, holy shit, this old white man is just gonna shout at shout at an empty chair, huh? That's what he's gonna do. He's gonna lecture an empty chair where the black president is, or he wants to believe the black president is, huh? Yee. So anyway, we'll move on from that to point 4, which is recent, actually, which is Clint Eastwood. I don't even know if it's his most recent movie, but jokes that were circulating about Clint Eastwood's possibly most recent movie that came out in the last year and a half. I don't know. I didn't watch it. Called The Mule, in which I am told, because everybody was making jokes about it, that the 90-year-old man has a threesome. And that was a good source of just absurd laughs for a variety of platforms for a while. So that's my perception of Gran Torino. Or of Clint Eastwood. My perception of Gran Torino is deeply involved in that, not in no small part because the cover of this film, which is probably in front of you right now, is Clint Eastwood and a gun and a car and a grimace. It doesn't look like something I want to watch, to be very frank. And these prior memories and prior sort of like mimetic understanding of Clint Eastwood doesn't make me think he's a guy I particularly want to hear the artistic ramblings of. But I've finally gotten around to watching the film, and here we are. Gran Torino is an interesting film, and it is very much not what I expected, at least initially. I have not settled on whether I think I like this film or not. However, I think it is overhyped. One of the other things I remember about the time around when it released is that it got a lot of awards buzz. I don't remember if it was specifically Oscar buzz or it was just people talking about it because it was sort of, for whatever reason, novel to the media's eyes. But I remember there being a lot of buzz around it, and that has stuck with me as part of my perception of the film, not knowing much of anything else about it. So I've always been aware that this was something I sort of wanted to watch out of curiosity, and because it was generally well received. But man, grimacing Clint Eastwood on the cover just doesn't seem like a story I want to hear. If I ever wanted to hear it, I would have to be in a very particular mood. That said, I'm glad I finally decided to watch it. I think, like I said, that it is a little bit overly hyped, but it is a lot better than my preconceptions of it would have suggested. I was very concerned that it was going to be an extremely shallow or even xenophobic, jingoistic, portrayal, self-congratulatory portrayal of an old white man living in America and being alarmed by foreigners. Thankfully, it is not that. And it very immediately in the film establishes that it is not that, which is something I appreciated. The very first scene does a lot to let you know that it is not that film. This is particularly fascinating to me from a PR standpoint, because my admittedly now 13-year-old recollection of the advertising that went on for it really seemed to pitch it as more of a thriller drama, and very much framed Eastwood's character as the heroic character. Now, 2008 was a different time. That's not an explanation, but I think it's important to consider cultural context for all sorts of things, not the least of which is marketing. And being well into, but not fully jaded with, the sort of bizarre nationalism that was continuing to reign following the twin wars in the Middle East, which are particularly pertinent to time of release of this video. That sort of attitude was pervasive enough that I think there was probably some concerted effort by the PR firms attached to the film to try and pitch this more towards that crowd. The crowd that is more conservative, more militaristic, and all the other things. I don't need to delve into specifics. But that had more of that sort of old war vet pride aura about them. So that makes the initial scene of this film all the more fascinating, because it pretty clearly makes fun of the main character, being Eastwood's character. From the very first scene, his portrayal is of a very clear, very obvious, to the point of almost borderline absurdity, curmudgeonly racist old man. Someone who has been set in his ways too long, and the world has left behind, and nobody wants anything to do with him, including his family. And that is a fascinating setup, both both textually and metatextually, as far as where you can go from there, and how you've already subverted expectations. It's one thing to have heroes and anti-heroes, but Eastwood's character, who I believe his name is Walt, is in sort of a unique place of being pretty overtly not villainous, but not a good person. It's rather unsubtle in its way of showing you that this is not somebody you should be rooting for. And I'm not sure if the the really aggressive overtness of that is just a matter of artistic choice, or if it is a deliberate countering of the expectations of a certain group of potential viewers. Again, that more conservative crowd. So, it's an interesting setup. What follows, however, while also interesting, is in many ways a return to what I had already thought was not about to happen in this film. The plot is not complex, and nor are the characters. The plot, the spoiler-free plot, is that curmudgeonly old white man with memories of his time in the Korean War doesn't like Asian people moving into his neighborhood and can't handle it. But obviously, with this being a film, he's not going to continue in that vein the entire time. He has to have some sort of arc, however minimal it may be. So quite obviously, the only arc that he really can have is to learn to be more tolerant. The problem is, he doesn't. And I guess we're going to get into a bit more of tonal spoilers at this point, because I don't know how to unpack this film without doing that. Walt never learns his lesson. The film thinks he does, but possibly the most overt indicator that there isn't a good arc for this character is the fact that from beginning to end, he slings racial slurs like you would not believe. And listen, I've met some racists in my time on this earth. I've met some people who throw around some really offensive terms. I have never met anyone who was that consistent in just, boy, I sure gotta get a racial slur in this sentence. Like, he's so bizarrely gung-ho about throwing a racial slur in every sentence to people's faces more often than not, that there is no real redemption. And don't get me wrong, I was not expecting or wanting redemption. He is an irredeemable character, fundamentally. Somebody who has lived 50 years with the pain and guilt and hatred in his heart against a group of people is not suddenly redeemed in a matter of a couple of weeks in the course of a movie. That would be absurd, and I would have been, had my cinematic sensibilities offended if they had gone that direction. And yet, the main problem I see is that it's not just that he maintains, like, he grows emotionally but maintains this insistence on using racial slurs. It's that everyone else in the film ignores it. And don't get me wrong, like, I fully recognize that there is an aspect of just someone in a minority group hears someone use a racial slur against them and just sort of like lets it pass because it's not worth the fight. But this character establishes relationships with people that are fairly intimate, and yet, despite that, still continues to their face to insult them and use these offensive terms. And it's not even moderated by, like, nobody ever attempts to stop him. Ever. In the entire course of the film. It's bizarre. The closest thing anyone gets is, like, correcting his pronunciation of some ethnic terms. So there's no real textual redemption for his character, not even in a minor way. And the juxtaposition between, these other characters who become more accepting of him, and his character who we're told by the film, is becoming more accepting of them, then it undercuts that sort of cross-cultural understanding by making him continue in this same vein of using these slurs. Now, admittedly, maybe this is a behavior that I've just never seen from a person, but I have a hard time understanding both sides of this. Both the racist old man who learns to respect people, but yet for some reason still maintains persists in using racial slurs. I don't understand that. I also don't understand the minority people who continue to accept without ever raising the issue, accept this person who they're trying to win over in some respect, without ever saying anything. It is just bizarre, and frankly, it is one of the main things that sort of kept me from getting fully engrossed in the movie. That said, there's still an interesting narrative here and a bunch of interesting ideas. The context for the film is really interesting to me, if only because it's not something I've ever seen before. Most of the characters, in fact, in this film are part of the Southeast Asian Hmong ethnic group. They are a group that where a lot of refugees from Southeast Asia migrated to particularly the Midwest after the Vietnam War because they had been persecuted before the war and they were being persecuted after the war. And so it's interesting to me to see Hmong people represented in film because they're an ethnic minority in the United States, but they're also because they're particularly isolated to mostly Minnesota and Wisconsin have large populations of Hmong people. And to see them represented at all is sort of fascinating. That said, it does get into some technical and geographical weirdness because this film appears to be set in Detroit, which is in Michigan. Now, there are Hmong people in Michigan, but there's much fewer of them there than there are in Wisconsin and Minnesota. At the same time, there are portions of this film that make reference to Minnesota. And so I was struggling to figure out where exactly this film was set. That was redoubled. This is something I had to check after the fact, by a shot in which there is a police cruiser with Highland Park on the side, which is a Chicago suburb. But it turns out there is actually also a Highland Park in Michigan. It is a much smaller town, but you can't just have Highland Park and, if people are aware of the Midwest, not have them think of Illinois before Michigan. So it was weird trying to figure out where this movie exactly was set. The overall arc of the story and the characters themselves are sort of in addition to what I've already mentioned, where I'd start to draw more issue. Because narratively speaking, this is not a particularly complex film, which is potentially fine. There are plenty of uncomplex films that are still very good. I think my problem is that none of the characters are particularly deep or interesting. Eastwood's character does not have a particular arc, as I've sort of also mentioned. And a lot of the other characters who he interacts with are fairly one note and don't have much of an arc of their own. There are some scenes that are quite compelling on their own, but between a somewhat stilted script and a bunch of actors who I think are probably relatively green, in addition to Eastwood, who is not a particularly good actor, if you ask me, make it a little bit hard to get really deeply invested. The characters in the film are mostly portrayed by actual Hmong people. It's not just, it's not the Hollywood tendency to just hire Asians for any Asian role, regardless of their ethnic background. So it is nice that in addition to portraying a relatively small minority in the United States, that they also hired people from that group. But there is the aspect of, experience in the industry. And there are a number of performances that are pretty middling to poor. None of them are really jarringly awful. But there's not there's some definite cases from some relatively major characters where their inexperience shows through. But again, the larger issue is sort of related to the script and the narrative, because the writing is stilted. As far as I'm aware, this is a script entirely written by a bunch of white guys. No surprise there. But it does mean that, in particular, scenes that don't involve Eastwood or any other white characters can be particularly stilted feeling, in terms of how natural conversations are. At the same time, there are a couple of scenes of tradition. Well, I'm not well versed in how accurate these things are, but in cultural rituals of Hmong people that, I mean, frankly, I would expect most Hollywood films to just ignore, leave out, not think are important or add depth. And so to have those in there at all is also kind of fascinating. And I do wonder, production wise, how those things were organized. Because I can't imagine Eastwood and the other scriptwriters writing those scenes as like, oh, yes, I'm well versed in this, traditional Hmong ritual for a newborn brought into a family or something like that. Something tells me they didn't do that. So how those things came to be, added to the script and added to the film is something I'm curious about. But again, the characters, while sometimes compelling, very few of them have a real arc. When they do have changes in their understanding of the world and understanding of each other, it's mostly for narrative purposes, not because it's actually reflective of a change in the character. So you have characters who are coincidentally behaving differently or having different trains of thought because it is narratively convenient for the story they're trying to tell. And so that gets into sort of the issue I was originally worried about with this film. While it is not the xenophobic, nationalistic thing I deeply feared, there is still a great amount of this film that troubles me as far as sort of a narrative of old white man self-congratulatory views, where by the end of the film you still get the sense that you're supposed to be rooting for Eastwood's character rather than seeing where he, I'm at risk of again, this is not strictly spoilers, but it's sort of getting in there. His passing on of his, big air quotes, wisdom is sort of troubling because it's not that the other characters take his viewpoints and resynthesize them or understand them in a different, greater cultural context, which I think would be more meaningful if you're trying to tell a story about older generations and newer generations, white versus non-white Americans, all these other things. I think it would be more compelling to have those interactions result in a synthesis rather than what I mostly saw in the film, which was these young Hmong characters basically mostly taking Eastwood's character's teachings at face value. Or, I mean, he's not a good teacher. His character would never be a good teacher in the first place. But there was some part in the depths of my stomach that was going, ooh, this is not the gross I thought it was going to be, but it's still kind of gross because it still feels like the ultimate story is old white man teaches immigrants how to be American. And obviously it's a lot more complex than that, but that was, nagging at the back of my head, and I just couldn't quite get past that. ultimately, the overall film is interesting and I think worth a watch. But it's not particularly complex. It's not particularly well acted. It's not particularly well shot or directed. Eastwood did direct this. The narrative isn't particularly compelling. The characters aren't particularly well fleshed out. And the overall arc of the story itself is also kind of, it's not a good ending. It's not a bad ending. It's not even particularly cathartic. So I sort of wonder what they were going for. It's still an interesting film. And it's well made enough and unique enough that I think it's worth the watch. But as far as being a great piece of cinema, or changing my mind fully about Eastwood and his ilk, that hasn't happened. I think this film is well known enough that probably a lot of people have watched it. I know at least one person has some strong feelings about it, so I hope to hear from them. But if you got thoughts on the film, if you think I misinterpreted something or I didn't get something out of it, or if you just have a different take, I'm interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. I think that's about all I have to say about it. Thanks you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.